If you happen to be browsing the newspapers during the 19th century, you probably would have read headlines about Ned Ludd and the Luddites. Now, they're not, as you might think, the name of some new age rock band, but they were rather a protest group that formed against the potential loss of jobs due to the introduction of automated weaving machines. The irony, of course, is that there are now more people employed in the textile business today than there were people alive in Europe in the 19th century. In other words, automation didn't cause opportunity to go away, it actually grew. Well, fast forward to the 21st century, and the headlines today don't actually sound that much different to those of the Luddites. But instead of manual work being automated, it's knowledge work that's up for grabs. And rather than weaving cotton, we're now using agentic technology to weave together ideas. Well, at least that's the promise. Hey there, and welcome to another episode of the AI Forecast. I'm your host, Paul Muller. Join me along with leading companies and industry experts as we explore the past, the present, and the future of data and AI in the enterprise every week. And if you haven't already done it, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. We really do appreciate the support that it brings us. And speaking of support, a huge thanks to the show sponsor Cloudera for bringing the podcast to life. Well, as I mentioned, today we're going to take a look at the topic of agentic technology and specifically how it might impact the work of white-collar workers. Should we be worried? To discuss this and more, we're joined by founder and CEO of DoubleO AI and Ignition, Derek Osgood. Now, Derek's career includes decades of experience as a traditional brand marketer and product manager, experience he now brings to bear at DoubleO in his mission to help non-technical users turn ideas into automation quickly and easily. Welcome to the podcast, Derek. It's going to be awesome. I'm looking forward to it as well. Where do we find you today?
I am currently calling in from Oregon, although normally I'm based in California, but I'm up enjoying the Pacific Northwest summer right now for the 4th.
You've got to do it. I love that. One of my favorite cities in the world. Before we get into the topic of agentic, and it is somewhat controversial, certainly the media is trying to make it that way at the moment, we do a little thing to kind of limber up, we call the Fast Four, the Furious Four. Lightning round, call it what you will. It's always the same. We just want to get to know you through a slightly different lens. Are you ready to play the game?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, let's get it going. First up, what would people who know you best say is your superpower?
Ooh, that's a good one. Well, professionally, I think they would say that my superpower is that I am a really strong systems thinker, and I, tend to break things down into, pretty kind of like cohesive chunks, and I can kind of like think fairly abstractly about how a bunch of different pieces are going to fit together, which is like largely kind of what ended up actually driving a lot of the DoubleO build that we did.
I love it. And personally?
I generally think that I'm super empathetic, and I think like I tend to understand people really well, which is I think what contributed to my background as a marketer.
The most impactful technology of all time.
Oh, this is a tough one. It has to be the internet, right? You could go way back and say fire. Like fire is probably the most impactful because we probably wouldn't exist as humans otherwise. But I think like in modern day, I would say it has to be the internet.
I'll take fire. I think that's great. Just to give you my answer, it's the beehive.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Well, think about it. Most of modern food production today depends on the pollination of crops, and that's through beehives. If we hadn't domesticated the bee, we probably wouldn't be eating today.
Yeah, totally. And then there's also like you could also say bread probably, the combination of like water and air.
There you go. Exactly right. Like, a lot of it's pretty lo-fi. The people in Portland would be pleased to know.
Yep.
The hipsters would be pleased to know. All right. Next up. What would you like to... We talk about AI automating everything all the time, right? And it's usually it's related to business. But what would you like to see personally be automated by AI in your future?
Oh, man, so many things. I mean, the one I get from everybody is everybody wants their email automated. Like, everybody just wants to get out of their inbox. But I actually don't hate email. I actually kind of like it, so I'm fine with that. I think I like to say that I would want all my kind of travel planning and, like, logistical coordination sorted. I think that's probably a big one. Not necessarily the planning, because I like the planning part of travel, but more so the just, like, coordination and like keeping me on schedule and like moving between places in the right time and place.
When you start that one up, I'll be a customer. And last but not least, it's one of those questions that sometimes need explanation, but I'll run it dry and see how we go. what are some of the best practices that you've learned as someone who works with data? What are the hacks that help you get the most out of data personally?
Working with data just broadly, that's a big question. It's a good question. I think the biggest the biggest thing that I've always found that's critical when you're working with data is mostly just having a really clear understanding of like what is the most important kind of metric that you are going to go and manipulate, like optimize around. I also think that kind of like correlates a bit with the need to like define counter metrics. I think a lot of people when they're working with data, they look for one specific metric that they're trying to understand, but they forget to look at kind of the metrics that are impacted by moving that one metric. And so, I think I tend to, try and take the approach when I'm working with data of like understand both like the thing that I'm trying to answer, but then also like what are the kind of like knock-on effects and, where do I need to look at like the opposite, reaction that's going to happen when you're looking at whatever that data point is.
Great advice. Let's get into it. Maybe tell us a bit about your background, because I would say it's not been a traditional linear tech CEO career. So let's wind the clock back a bit. How did Derek come to be Derek?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I didn't jump into, founding companies when I was in my 20s, like a lot of the, I think, YC founders and whatnot out there do. I actually, I always knew that I wanted to start a company, and I always knew that I wanted to be a tech founder. When I was even, 5 years old, I was telling my parents like, oh, I want to be Bill Gates. And, I didn't even know what that meant at that point. I just thought it was cool. Generally, where I came to this from was I actually took the route that I took largely to prepare myself for this. So like when I was in school, tech wasn't really a thing yet. And, I'm aging myself here, but, when I was coming out of school, like a lot of the big consumer CEOs all came out of like brand management backgrounds, because that is like functionally product management when you talk about CPG companies. And I thought I wanted to be in consumer. And so, I came out and I like went into brand management, thinking that I was going to go down that path. And like, I also was just always fascinated by marketing and kind of the split of kind of like creative and data-driven, sides of it. And I think it aligned well with like how I think about like strategy and like, systems thinking. And so I generally just like kind of went into that path thinking that that was going to be the route towards becoming a founder later on. And then obviously, in my first couple of years kind of in the market, tech started becoming a thing. And so, I was working in brand management. I kind of like, moved into like growth roles in early stage startups, thinking that, I kind of after coming out of PlayStation, I wanted to go and, kind of understand how smaller companies built things. Did that for a little while, and then, ended up kind of like bopping around a little bit, where I was in both kind of like product and marketing roles through that whole cycle as, like, because I always took the approach that like product and marketing are kind of like fundamentally intertwined. And I think that, product is like a subset of marketing and marketing is a subset of product. And you kind of need those things to work interoperably in order for both either to be effective. And so I kind of like, explored both paths, and built me like a really nice like generalized skill set. And then I ended up kind of like realizing while doing that I had been running into the same problems over and over and at every single company that I was at, and trying to build out like effective go-to-market processes and how do you launch new things. And that led me to starting Ignition, which was our previous company, which was an AI product management platform built for helping to like concept and launch new things with a bunch of research tools built into that. And while building Ignition, we kind of realized that like we had been building agentic stuff since before agents were really a thing. And we were building a lot of these AI features into Ignition, and we had to figure out like how do you orchestrate agents kind of at scale. And then, agentic AI became, much more kind of prevalent in the universe in the last like year or so. And we realized kind of as customers were starting to increasingly ask us for like way more custom, workflow, that we had already built this really powerful orchestration tool that I was using personally as like the non-technical person on the team to build a lot of my own personal workflows that we were using to power a lot of our product workflows. And so we decided to kind of like stand it up and expose it as a standalone thing, which is what became DoubleO. I kind of like just kind of stumbled into this. I knew I always wanted to start a company, and like COVID hit, and I kind of like decided, hey, if not now, when? And I had also been running into this problem for so many years that I was like, I have to go solve this because nobody else seems like they're going to, and just went out and started a company around it.
I've got to ask the question: what does the DoubleO and DoubleO mean?
We're playing on the James Bond thing, so we're like AI agents, DoubleO agents, just kind of lightly riffing on it.
Super fun.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, as I alluded to in the opening, Agentic is, and I think you just talked to the idea that In the last 12 months, it's gone from being, really wasn't a term of art that was widely used, to being certainly front and center of the tech news most of the time. And if not necessarily using the term agentic, the idea that, lawyers, marketers, software developers, all of their jobs are basically going to be, taken by the machine and automated away. And it is one of those things. In the media, if it bleeds, it leads. It's a great fear story to get some eyeballs on your news. How much of it do you think is based on just a misunderstanding of what agentic means? Because it is one of those terms that sort of gets bandied around. What does it mean to you?
The term agent is like kind of the gift and the curse for me. It's like you said, it's bandied around by everybody. It means totally different things when people talk about it. And like most of the people that are using the word agent, like in many cases, they're not even actually referring to anything actually agentic. They're referring to like functionally just like a workflow or an automation in a traditional sense that is a lot more structured. So I define agents and agentic as, you are using LLMs as kind of the brain, and you're using some kind of function calls as tools and arms and legs to allow an LLM to take action. So ultimately an agent, anything agentic, is something that can non-deterministically like decide what to do to accomplish a goal from among an array of possible actions, and then take that action. And usually that's how, there's a bunch of technical ways that the LLMs actually do that, but ultimately it's about just like an automation that allows for something to decide, like an autonomous system to decide what to do from multiple possible things, and then go do that thing. And so it's actually able to act, which is a big difference from like raw LLMs, which are mostly kind of Q&A machines, and all they're able to do is kind of like react to stimulus based on the data that they're trained on. Agents are able to usually go like retrieve information from external tools. Agents can go and like actually take action in external tools by creating documents or, updating systems. So they're a lot more kind of like powerful than just like the raw LLMs that a lot of us are kind of like familiar with through ChatGPT as kind of like, early AI exposure.
To paraphrase it, I suppose you could say that it is, to the way you put it, is it is like giving your LLMs arms and legs. They can now start to interact with the world. They can touch and affect the world. So I think that's a good working definition. We're going to get into the hype, for want of a better term, in a second. We're going to get into the potential in a second. But inevitably, I find when new technologies like this appear, there are I shouldn't say curmudgeonly types, there are the skeptical types who will jump up and say, yep, the media and the vendors have got it somewhat right. There is a lot of potential and promise here, but it is being overhyped. Expectations are set way too high. I think we even have the trough of disillusionment with the Gartner curve, right? Talk to me about the idea that agents are being potentially overhyped, the idea that these things are going to be able to, in the next 3, 6, 12 months, replace people in terms of being able to do a wide variety of things. Do you think that expectations are now too high in terms of what agentic can do for us?
Yeah, it's funny. I can wax poetic about all the philosophy around this. So I think the funny thing that I see building in this space is I think everybody exists in like one of two extremes right now. They either think like AI is magic and it can do anything, and it is like literally wave a magic wand and an agent will figure out how to do the thing that you've never been able to do yourself as a person, and that is definitely not true. And then the other extreme is like AI is stupid and can't figure out anything because it hallucinates and it gets things wrong every time I try and do anything with it. And that is also not true. AI is a lot more powerful than what like most of the population actually realizes, but AI is simultaneously a lot less powerful than what everybody fears. So I think like the real answer is somewhere in the middle. And I think that, like where a lot of the misunderstanding comes from is, I think everybody's been pushing this idea of like agentic tools being like goal driven objects, right? Where you can basically like say, hey, look, like I'm going to give you an end goal as AI, and you're going to go like figure out how to solve this end goal. And the reality is like that's where you actually run into LLMs doing really dumb stuff. They go off the rails, they hallucinate, they start like, going off on weird tangents, and, because the way that they reason is just, a very foreign way of thinking, and they don't really have any guardrails or structure in place around them. So you end up with them like hallucinating and creating, and they're not able to like just go accomplish a goal. Like a person, you can give it just like You can give a person an end goal, and a person will spend, if they spend 6 months, like no matter what the end goal is, like they're probably going to figure out a way to go achieve that goal. An LLM will not do that. It will go off on strange tangents. It'll forget like earlier steps in the process. It's really hard to make it like do that. But if you give an LLM like, clear instructions and a process, and you break it into smaller steps, and you turn like kind of what the end outcome that you're trying to achieve into a process, an LLM can do almost anything. And so I do think like there is this weird kind of combination of like people being afraid that like AI is going to take their jobs, but I think what it's actually going to do is it's going to, and I come from this obviously from like, founder building in this space. Like I'm incentivized to talk about this like through the lens of like, yeah, this can take everybody's job, and, it can, go replace whatever you're doing. I think, anybody that's building in AI, and especially in agentic AI right now, will tell you like it's far, far, far from taking people's jobs. And I think a big part of that is the lack of like ability to reason through like long-term problems in a, like towards a specific goal and stay on track. And then the other big problem there is also there's no proactivity. Like if you think about what's the big difference between an autonomous agent that has a goal that's like being set to run, let's say on a daily, weekly, monthly cadence or what have you, or off of some kind of trigger that happens in a tool, that thing is not proactively deciding, hey, I need to go do something. It's not waking up in the morning and saying, hey, like, our company's goal is this, so we need to now like take this XYZ action. A person does that. And so like there's no proactivity built into AI. There's no way to program proactivity without a lot of like really creative, legit like gymnastics around how you're going to structure a workflow to be proactive. And so I think it's a long way off. And like most people, I deal with companies all the time that are trying to build this stuff. And like most people are still trying to figure out their own process, much less like how to build agents that are able to like literally proactively work on that process. And so I think it's like, it's a lot further off than everybody, is like fear mongering around. But I also do think like, there are scenarios where you can replace significant swaths of human work. That doesn't necessarily mean that the jobs go anywhere though. That's the other thing is like, we work with customers today where, they've like, I've got, one customer, they have replaced 90+% of the work that they were doing on this one task previously, which is like a medical coding process. Medical coding is very routine, like manual work. LLMs do a great job of it. They had people this was their whole job. They were like doing nothing but doing medical coding all day long. And they replaced 90% of the effort that those people were spending. Those people didn't get fired. Those people ended up becoming kind of like QA people for the agents that were running and automating that work. And now they're building new processes and building new agents and building new automation. So I think like humans end up kind of like evolving into, new scope and understanding, kind of like, hey, I automated this thing away. Now I can go and start to do these other things that are, higher value.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons why I opened up today's podcast the way I did is, if you'd have been in the 19th century in the UK, you would have been sitting there thinking that weaving machines were going to end the job of weavers. And I had to do, ironically, I used ChatGPT just to do a bit of fact checking. But there were about 400 million people living in all of Europe around that time. There are 400 million people working in the textiles industry now, like literally more than there were alive in the entire continent at the time. There weren't less jobs. There are actually more jobs for people. But look, again, the media's incentivized to attract eyeballs, and they're not going to sell many newspapers if the headline says it's probably going to be a nice day today. Or today's going to be a lot like yesterday. Would probably not get many people reading newspapers. So I can understand that. And I want to just apologize to our audience, or maybe not to our audience, but to you. I've kind of flipped the script a little bit today. I wanted to open up with the hype question because I do think it's really important. This isn't going to be a love letter to Agentic, nor is it going to be a beat up. I think I want to take a pragmatic view of it. And I'm really pleased with the way you open things up, because I think that does represent a really responsible balance between talking to the potential, but also talking down the fact that this is not necessarily the bogeyman that it's made out to be. So let's talk about how and where we can use it. What are some of the use cases that you've seen that just smash hits that, you love applying the technology to, because it does just generate that kind of delight when people see it and go, wow, I didn't think that you could get a computer to do that without tons of coding or writing really complex rule sets and if this then that's in workflow tools.
I think like where agentic AI like really shines is like various forms of like data processing, and that can be like data extraction, which you're then taking data and transforming it into some other format and then putting it into another system. So like the medical coding example is a good example where you have to go like review a doctor like a doctor referral, pull out some information about a patient, for example, or about the visit, and then you need to like apply a couple of rules and like based on some documentation go and add codes to the service and say, okay, like I'm going to apply some like insurance billing codes, and then I'm going to put it into my billing system. And so like agentic AI is great at that kind of thing, where it's just like it's mostly rules based, but it's just about like reading unstructured data, reformatting that unstructured data in a way that like needs to be inserted elsewhere. And so it's awesome at that kind of thing. It's also awesome at like various form, like in kind of the same vein, like a lot of like deep research types of workflows. And I think like deep research is like also I'm gonna go off on a tangent here. I think like I have strong feelings about the way that like I think ChatGPT and some of the kind of like chat-based tools are training people on how AI works. The way that they do deep research is very different from the way that like we build deep research into DoubleO, where they're not looking at like the entire pages that they're researching against. So they're looking at like little chunks of every page and taking notes basically, and then they create like a summary of summaries when they come up with their final output for you. When you're not doing that, agents are fantastic at going and like seeking information, looking at specific sites, collating that into various forms of reports, like going and looking at like X page, Y page, Z page, and then creating like, for example, competitive intel, some recap of a competitor and like how you should position against them based on what your company does. So I think like anything that involves like retrieving data, kind of reformatting that data and inferring outputs, or inferring like information around that, agents are killer at. I think they're actually like interestingly very good also at kind of communication. So obviously like because AI is like or LLMs generally have been like built around this chat paradigm, they're really good at conversing back and forth. So like when you build agents that are designed to like email folks, like you can have those agents like email and react to the responses, and they can actually like converse back and forth kind of like similarly to how a person would. So that's great for things like contract review. So being able to like intake a contract, review the contract against like some specific legal terms that you're concerned about, and identify like anything that's possibly problematic, then go email that back to the person who sent the contract originally and ask for changes, and then wait for the response and like get that back and kind of like converse back and forth until you come to agreed upon like negotiated terms. I think all of that stuff is pretty bread and butter. I think where agents like really struggle is when you talk about like they really struggle when you talk about things that require really massive data sets, because there's limitations on the context window and how much they can actually intake. So there, like a lot of people are like, oh, I can give it access to like my entire database and it'll fit like and have it like run analysis on my business. It's very hard to make agents do that kind of thing effectively. It's also very hard to make them do what I would call like broad research. It's very easy to make them do deep research on one specific topic, but then having them go and like, for example, find every company in the US that is, a medical company that has 100 employees or more. That kind of thing is incredibly hard to make agents do. So I think as long as you stay away from like, really massive data sets, and as long as you stay away from basically kind of like broad research, like you tend to be able to find use cases all over the place inside of companies that agents are great at.
That last part surprised me. I would have probably just gone on a fool's errand trying to apply it to exactly that kind of use case, because when I think of a lot of these tools, I think of, AI is trained on massive data sets, and therefore, hey, I've got a massive data set. What a perfect thing to apply to an LLM and to an agentic type of problem. I would have wasted a lot of time and money. So one of the things that I find, speaking of that, is I'm technical enough, I'd argue, but keeping pace with the rapidly changing nature of technology, and frankly, I am time poor, so having the time to, while I'm adept at learning it, it just takes time out to, to get proficient at some of these new technologies. So inevitably, I think a lot of us just pass it by and we rely on our IT teams to go and develop it for us. Is there a chance that we could, or what's your experience been in non-technical people using these sorts of technologies?
I find that actually like non-technical people with agents specifically, and it depends on, again, like how you define an agent, right? Because there's versions of agents which are much more kind of like developer oriented. They're much more kind of like granular in the way that they construct tasks. Developers are great at that stuff. I think like when you talk about like agents in kind of the abstract though, where they're like kind of a structured experience that like is able to be given a goal and like go and take action on it, I actually find non-technical people are arguably better than developers at using and taking advantage of agents. And part of that is because I think like a lot of, like prompting best practices and the way that you kind of like give instruction to LLMs is very similar to the way that you give instruction to people. And it's actually very different from the way that you give instruction to computers. And so I think that like I tend to find that, non-technical folks end up having like a bit of a leg up in quickly adopting AI because the way that they communicate is mostly around like, instructing human beings how to do whatever they're trying to do. And LLMs behave very similarly to humans. And so I think it's the communication style for non-technical folks actually lends itself really, really well to this kind of thing. I do think like where they tend to have a little bit more trouble is kind of understanding like the basics around how their tools work. And so oftentimes, like I'll talk to folks who, may not understand like how APIs work. And so they're like, well, I want to have my agent, go update Salesforce or send an email from Salesforce. And like, if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong, but I believe Salesforce doesn't have an API for sending email via Salesforce. Like they have an API to go update deals. They have an update, they have APIs for all sorts of updates inside of Salesforce, but I'm pretty sure you can't trigger an email to a customer via API. I might be wrong, but a lot of times like people won't realize that that's just literally not a thing that an API can do inside of those tools. And then they'll try and expect their agent to be able to go and do that thing that they can do as a person. And usually agents can't do that because most agents are going to operate the tools that they're using via API. They're not going to operate them like in a browser. So that's where you end up like running into problems with non-technical folks is them just not like fully understanding kind of their own process and like how you would kind of like construct a workflow around it. But I think, from a like general direction to agents and understanding kind of like how do I build an agent effectively, if it's just a self-contained like single task, like non-technical folks are great at it. And I've found that, they tend to have a lot of success. And I think like there's kind of like some pseudo-technical folks that kind of sit in the middle. Oftentimes like you have marketing ops teams, you have like rev ops teams. Those folks are great at using agents. And like they adopt this stuff really, really fast because they're used to kind of tackling automation like through the lens of traditional workflow automation, which looks similar to kind of like the concepts underlying how agents work.
You mentioned marketing and RevOps sales, an area that I like you have a lot of experience in. So talk to me about what are you seeing in that world? What are some of the opportunities? What are some of the things that I could potentially do with Agentic that right now is, driving me bonkers because it's either expensive, slow, or boring?
I'll actually give you like kind of a full case study of like how do you build like a whole system around this?
Yeah, let's do it.
So I think like you can do a lot of these things as one-off examples, right? Like you could build individual agents for any part of your kind of like marketing or sales process. But the way that we kind of tend to like think about agentic systems is like building, how do you like construct a system that's able to run like somewhat autonomously, right? And so what we would like one example would be first, you got to do a bunch of research when you are going and building out a knowledge base around your company. So let's say you need to like you would create an agent that would go and, first deeply research every competitor you have, and then kind of dump all that research into a database. You would then create an agent which would probably do some continuous monitoring on those competitors. So you would want to go like check their website, check their blog for all the new things that they're releasing every single month or week or whatever. And you would dump that into the same database. And then you might want to also build a research workflow that goes and like does specialized research on all the leads that you have. So you have all these leads inside your database and you have new leads coming in every day. You would probably build a workflow that every time you get a new lead, that lead goes and, the agent looks at their LinkedIn, it looks at their information about their company, it kind of infers information about like what services inside your company are they likely going to be interested in. It could then even actually qualify that lead. So it could also take that information and compare it against a database that you've set up around like what your company does and like who your ideal customer is, and say, hey, this lead like looks like they are or aren't qualified. But the really cool stuff is like once you have that kind of like base level of research around your competitors, around your company, around your leads, you can then start to like hang agentic workflow off of that. So you could have, after the agent kind of like intakes that lead, researches them and qualifies them, if they're qualified, you could have it hand off to another agent, which would then go and send personalized outreach to that lead that just signed up for your product. And it can say, hey, like, you seem like you're the type of person who's going to be interested in this service that we specifically offer based on these specific things that I found in my research about you. In the same way that like a person would do kind of like SDR research if they're reaching out to a customer. And that agent can then go email them. If they respond back and they say, hey, like, I'm interested, I would love to have a meeting, that agent could then go update your CRM with information about that person, and then it could book a meeting with them on your calendar. And so you can actually like build this full cycle, like inbound to outbound motion, where every time a lead comes in, they get researched deeply, they get outreach to, and then the meeting gets booked. And then, you would have some separate workflows for like, for example, customer onboarding. But all of it's going and retrieving information from that research that's been done by those research agents up front and stored in a database. And then those agents that are actually doing the outreach are just kind of like action agents where they're executing process.
Talk to me about some of the unintended consequences, to go back to our Furious 4, our Fast 4 about data and you looking for the counter narrative. How do you guard against the fact that, your workflow, and again, I want to be clear, whether it's a human or a computer doing it, errors creep in, confirmation bias creeps in. The main difference here is you're automating it, which means if there's a problem in your logic or in the way you briefed your agent, it's going to amplify quite rapidly, more rapidly than even when a human's involved. How do you manage that process just to make sure that it doesn't start to run off the rails? As I say, through no fault of its own, maybe it just got a bad brief from you.
I think this is where a lot of people, especially when they're first kind of introducing themselves to like agentic AI and like just in automation in general, is like people are inherently nervous about, a machine pushing the button instead of them pushing the button, right? And so in a lot of agentic workflows, like you can build human in the loop steps in. So you could, for example, like in that same workflow I just described, most of the research stuff, like it getting dumped into a database, that's not going to really impact you negatively. So you're fine. Like, if you get a little bit of junk research, like, okay, that's cool. We'll just account for that. But I think obviously you don't want to be reaching out to customers, like inadvertently with bad messaging, because you could degrade your kind of brand's performance with them. And so I think like what you can often do is like you could in that same workflow have a, check in the middle where, while you're building that workflow, like reaches out to the customer, it could send a human the list of qualified leads first, and that human could then go trigger a separate workflow to go run for all the qualified leads, so that human is at least like gut checking the work that the agents have done before they go and actually do the thing that's the sensitive action. So I think like building human in the loop steps into processes that you're building agentically is always best practice. And then I think the other big component is it's really important to have like observability and governance around the agents that you build. I think this is where like a lot of like homegrown agentic solutions end up falling down, is like, when you have like a developer kind of build an agent for like doing all this outreach yourself in-house, like they probably aren't going to build a lot of like dashboarding and visibility into like what did the agents do and why did they do it. And I think that makes it really hard for you to audit the process. And so I think like, using whether it's a tool or whether it's your own homegrown process for kind of like building observability into the system, it's super important to like have visibility into what actions the agents take. And like we do this with DoubleO by building like, we actually have like real-time evals built into every step in our process. So we actually have like a manager agent that like checks the work of every agent that does, any action inside of our systems to make sure that it's accurate, that it did the right thing before it moves on to whatever the next step is. And then I think the last bit is like just the process that you use when rolling out these workflows is super important too. Like you should never just go straight to like, I'm going to test automation at scale, right? Like you should always test with like something that you're doing manually, run it like onesie twosie first, make sure it's doing the right thing, then run it 5 to 10 items, probably still manually kicked off like via you uploading a CSV or something like that. Run that 5 to 10 times, see if it works. If you run into issues, like, roll it back and then scale up from there gradually. It's the same as kind of like scaling ad platforms or anything else that we do in marketing is you start small, you gradually roll out into bigger and bigger scale over time. And I think that's, you can do that really quick, but it's, you just kind of need to like gradually do it instead of just launching the whole thing all at once.
Yeah. And look, let's be clear. If you were to replace the term agent with intern, all those same rules would apply.
100%.
Nothing changes, right? So we need to be mindful here that it's not, as I say, it's not the bogeyman it's made out to be. Wrapping up with some of this now, in terms of, you talked about observability and you talked about, I suppose, governance. What are some of the governance concepts that either, individual contributors and maybe mid-level managers need to be thinking about? And what are some of the things that you would recommend that board level folks be thinking about in terms of this technology, or at least maybe trying to anticipate, because there'll always be the law of unintended consequences. We won't be able to get it right the first time. What should people be asking for to be in those dashboards, for example? What should they be keeping a weather eye out for?
So before I answer that, I'll actually like give one big caveat, which is I actually think one of the biggest things that folks get wrong when they are structuring their like AI strategy overall is they account for a 0% margin of error. And they say, hey, look, like this thing's going to be 100% perfect 100% of the time. But then they compare that against what their people are doing. And like humans do it 80% right, 100% of the time. And it's like, it's really important for you to be realistic about like what is an acceptable error rate. There are obviously going to be processes where things are not going to be 100% or where things have to be 100%. But like those are not things that you should be using LLMs for in the first place, because LLMs are not really designed around that. So it's important to like be realistic about like what your actual error tolerance is before you go and like define what your governance strategy is. So I think that's really critical. But I think, like when you're thinking about governance, the biggest thing is like first understanding like, are there guardrails in the first place? Like most systems out there, and especially if you're building this in-house, like it's very important to be careful about this. Most systems do not have any actual like error handling or governance tools built into them at all. There's no evals happening. They may be doing post evals where they're looking at like after the workflow has run, going back and looking at like, did it do it correctly? But it's not course correcting if the LLM gets anything wrong in the middle of a workflow. And it's not actually like killing a workflow if the workflow runs into an error, or it's not flagging human in the loop things that need to be surfaced to users if it needs review. So making sure that there are actual guardrails in place and that it's not just like deferring all of the complexity to an LLM and letting the LLM run wild around it, which like a lot of agentic tools are doing today. And then I think that's probably number one. Number two is just having visibility into, again, like, LLMs are a black box. You can't see like why the LLM made a decision. You can see, some of the thinking with some of the reasoning models if you want to surface that. But by and large, it's very hard to see like, how did it get to this data? So more importantly is you need to be able to see what data did it reference in its output. And so you need to be able to look back at like, okay, if it went and retrieved data from a database or from a website or wherever, where did it source that data? And then on the other side of that is like, in the output, again, like what tools did it use? What functions were called? Having all that underlying tracing is super important, which like, again, you don't have out of the box with most of the agentic systems. Like it's very hard to actually build that tracing effectively so you can see the important stuff and not have to just go spot check it constantly.
So attribution, attestation, all of the, it's all good governance stuff that would be true if you put a person in the middle of that sentence as well, I guess, right? Is like, what were your sources? I mean, we asked the same question, as I say, of an intern. Nothing's new under the sun, really, is it? Look, Derek, it's been an absolutely fabulous conversation. If people are interested in learning more about Agentic or maybe trying to pilot it themselves for a process, where can they go to learn more?
Our website's DoubleO.ai, spelled the word double and then the letter O. AI. And then if they want to reach out on LinkedIn, I'm on LinkedIn, LinkedIn/Derek Osgood 3. And always love to hear from folks.
And you've got a fabulous blog page I highly recommend reading for folks. It's a lot of fun. You have to explain the space helmet at some stage. But that's for another podcast. Ignition
was fun NASA branding, so I got to play around with that a little bit.
I love that. All right. Well, that's a wrap. What's your take, folks? Are we talking agents of change or chaos agents? Drop your thoughts into the comment section or hit us up on LinkedIn using the handle @Cloudera with your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. This is a controversial topic for some folks. Thanks again to Cloudera for hosting another episode of the AI Forecast. And thank you all for listening in. We will see you all next week.